Hello and welcome to session 3. In this session, we're going to be talking all about macronutrients. All right, let's get started. Now, you would have remembered from last week or last session, we touched on something called the acceptable macronutrient distribution range. Now, this particular range is an indication of how much of each macronutrient we should consume based on energy intake. So let's take protein for example. It is recommended that we consume 15 to 25% of our energy intake, here we go, from protein each day. In regards to carbohydrates, it is recommended that we consume between 45 and 65% of our energy intake from carbohydrates. With fats, it is recommended that we consume between 20 and 35% of our energy intake each day from fats. Now, something to note here is when it comes around to the consumption of fats, it is recommended that no more than 10% of this should be coming from saturated fats. Now, these proportions of each macronutrients are designed in a way for particular micronutrients to be consumed as well. This particular distribution range is recommended for healthy individuals and not necessarily for the treatment of disease. Now, macronutrients in themselves all contribute to energy in some way or another. Some macronutrients provide more energy, such as fat, where other macronutrients, let's say carbohydrates, produce less energy per gram, but can actually provide a more easier to utilize source of energy in comparison to, let's say, fat or protein. Now, an imbalance of these macronutrients can actually affect micronutrient intake. So for an example, if we actually limit the intake of fat, we could actually reduce the intake of, let's say, fat-soluble nutrients. So fat-soluble nutrients such as vitamin A, vitamin E, vitamin D, and vitamin K are all found in fatty foods. So if we reduce the fats in our diet, then we're also going to be reducing this subclass of nutrients, these fat-soluble nutrients. Now, there's different categories and different groups and different forms of these macronutrients. Starting off here at dietary fats, they can be broken down into a number of groups, and we're going to be discussing this in depth in this session. They can be categorized as saturated, polyunsaturated, or monounsaturated. And we'll discuss what it means by being unsaturated versus saturated and poly versus mono when we discuss fats in more depth in the coming slides. Carbohydrates, yes, they are delicious. They can be broken down into a number of categories or be defined whether or not they are starchy, whether or not they have prebiotic fibers in it. So prebiotic fibers meaning that they're good for the bacteria within the gut. Some carbohydrates are actually sugars, whether they be simple sugars or complex sugars. And we can also categorize these carbohydrates into low or high glycemic index foods. In regards to protein, we've got a number of things at play here, whether or not the protein is complete, the quality of the protein, and whether or not a particular essential amino acids are found within these protein-rich foods. Now, we discussed this last week, but let's go over it again because this information is important to understand. Now, if we're looking at how much energy is derived from each of these macronutrients, we can calculate it in kilojoules. So for instance, each gram of fat contributes 35 kilojoules per individual gram. Now, you can compare that to, let's say, protein and carbohydrates. Protein and carbohydrates, where less energy per gram are found within protein and carbohydrates. Now, even less is found within fiber. Only 8 kilojoules per gram of fiber-rich foods are found. Why? Well, we'll discuss this when we talk about dietary fibers and resistant starch, but we've got some fibers which aren't actually broken down within in our small intestines. They're actually stay kind of intact within our small intestines and go on to our large intestines, where they actually become fermented. Thereby, they're not actually contributing to energy, but they're actually contributing to, let's say, digestive health in the large intestines. The other element that produces energy, not necessarily a macronutrient, but it is alcohol intake, and that is it is alcohol in itself can contribute up to 29 kilojoules per gram of alcohol. Now on this side here, we've got the calories that it produces, but here in Australia, we'll stick with kilojoules. Carbohydrates, well, we all love them. Carbohydrates in themselves include a variety of different food items. You can see on this image here, it includes things like bread, root vegetables, grains, and the vast majority are plant-based, so found within plants and not necessarily within animal-derived products. Now, what's quite interesting with carbohydrates in comparison to the other macronutrients is carbohydrates are the preferred source of energy. It's the most abundant source of energy for the human body. And the primary role of dietary carbohydrates is to produce energy, particularly for the brain. The brain requires a high amount of glucose for its metabolism within the brain. Other organs requiring or having a preference for glucose include your kidneys, muscles, and the heart. Now, our body can actually store carbohydrates, and it stores it in the form of glycogen. And glycogen can be stored within either the liver or the muscles. Now, there are a number of categories when it comes around to carbohydrates, one of which is the classification between simple carbohydrates and complex carbohydrates. Let's start off with simple carbohydrates. Simple carbohydrates can be broken down into two major groups. You've got your monosaccharides and your disaccharides. Monosaccharides, mono meaning one, di meaning two. Monosaccharides are a single or simple carbohydrate. So that's your glucose, your fructose, and your galactose. And these are the most simplest forms of carbohydrates. Now, still within simple carbohydrates, you have your disaccharides, which is a combination of your monosaccharides. So either glucose, fructose, or galactose will form together to create lactose or sucrose, these other disaccharides. Moving over to here, your complex carbohydrates. They are things we call polysaccharides, poly meaning many. Now, this particular group can include things like your starches, your fibers, and your glycogen, which is that stored glucose within your body. We'll discuss this simple element on the next slide. Okay, this image, it's quite an interesting one. So there's this other category of carbohydrates called your glycemic response or your glycemic index. Now, your glycemic response is how elevated your glucose is in your blood after the consumption of particular carbohydrate-rich foods or any foods, might I say. So our baseline for what a glycemic response is glucose. So when we consume, let's just say, just glucose by itself, what we'll have is, now this table here is time. So we've got 15 minutes, 30 minutes, 45, 60, and so forth. And then going up is the amount of glucose within your blood. So if we consume just glucose, we will have this increased peak at about 30 minutes, and then it will drop down by about 120, so 2 hours after the consumption. Now let's take potatoes for an example. Potatoes are what we classify as a high glycemic index food, okay? So it follows a very similar line as glucose. It goes straight up, and at about 30 minutes it peaks. So the highest amount of glucose within our blood reaches at about 30 minutes. After that time, it drops quite significantly. So here's we got 1 hour, and by about an hour and a half, it drops down. Now, we've all had this before where we eat something really sugary, let's say potatoes or even simple carbohydrates, where we eat it and then 30 minutes after we feel great. We're like, oh yeah, this sugar is fantastic. But then about an hour and a half after we eat it, we get what we call a sugar slump. That's where your blood glucose goes below what it should actually be, and you get fatigue and a number of other symptoms relating to low glucose within our blood. The other line here is, let's say, pasta or noodles, generally classified as low GI. That is because it will probably be a complex carbohydrate. Complex carbohydrates, remember, are polysaccharides. Now, that basically means after we consume it, 30 minutes after, there's going to be a significantly lower increase in this overall blood glucose response, right? And then at about 60 minutes, it will kind of level out. There won't be this dip down, this let's say sugar crash, if we're having foods which have a low glycemic index. So the question you should ask now is, well, tell me more about this glycemic index. Just you wait. All right, so your glycemic index is a ranking of foods according to the potential to raise blood glucose levels. Okay, generally speaking, we can classify it as a low glycemic index food or a high glycemic index food. Now, a low glycemic index food doesn't make the blood glucose rise really high, and it's a sustainable energy. Whereas high glycemic index foods cause our blood glucose to peak, to go up real high. It can actually damage some of our vital organs because there's free glucose within our system, and then it will cause that crash. There are a number of, let's say, pros and cons when it comes around to using the glycemic index to determine this food is good, this food is bad. First of all, the glycemic response can actually differ from person to person. Some, let's say, low glycemic index foods, so that's what we want low glycemic index foods. If they actually contain particular fibers, such as soluble fiber, it can actually slow down the release of glucose within our system, which is optimal. Particular food elements, so if you actually add fat to a high glycemic index food, it will actually slow down the release of glucose within our small intestines and within our stomach, resulting in it becoming a low glycemic index food. So let's look at a few examples of what a high and low glycemic index food looks like. So here we've got a number of different categories. We've got grains, vegetables, fruits, dairy products, and proteins. Starting off at the lowest and working your way down to the highest. So we can see things like here, spaghetti, Spaghetti has a glycemic index of 42, which makes it a low glycemic index food. However, if we go down to the bottom of the cereals, we can see things like white bread. Yes, I'm sure a number of you would have consumed white bread in your life. White bread ranks at 100, okay? And that there is classified as a high glycemic index food. Looking at vegetables, the vast majority of vegetables are actually low glycemic, okay? Fruits, yes, a lot of fruits are low glycemic. However, you've got watermelon here, which is technically classified as high glycemic. Dairy products, because dairy products have got fat within them, I alluded to this a little earlier, because dairy products have got fat in them, that slows down the release of the glucose, and then thereby will actually have a low glycemic response. Very similar over here with protein, because protein has got other elements, not just, let's say, carbohydrates. It will actually slow down the release, and then thereby the vast majority of protein-rich foods, even though chickpeas and peas and kidney beans will actually contain carbohydrates, they will have a low glycemic index. Now, sugar. Sugar is bad. We can just say that. The World Health Organization, WHO, has a number of things to say about sugar. The vast majority of these will not come as a surprise. First of all, adults who consume less sugar have lower body weights. Why? Because of an increased consumption of sugar or simple carbohydrates can contribute to obesity. And that's exactly what they said for number 2. Let's go back. Number 3, children with the highest intakes of sugar-sweetened drinks are more likely to be overweight in comparison to those children with the lower intake of sugar-sweetened drinks. In regards to dental cavities, when intake of free sugar is above 10% of total energy, here we go, 10% of total energy intake, there is an increased risk of dental cavities in comparison to children where their total sugar intake is below 10%. So what does sugar do to your body? Okay, the list is long, but let's start over here. It can actually affect your memory. So the high consumption of simple carbohydrates or high glycemic index foods can actually affect your memory. So next time you're cramming for an exam, rather than going for a sweet chocolate bar or something that's high in sugar, go for something that's high in protein, because thereby it may actually support with retaining the vital information for your final exam. Too much sugar can result in something called insulin resistance. That is, your body becomes resistant to insulin. Insulin is a particular hormone which brings in glucose into the cells. It's a signaling molecule. And sometimes if someone consumes too much sugar, you develop something called insulin resistance. The high amounts of sugar in the diet can increase the risk of a number of diseases such as cancer, gout, and kidney disease. You've got fructose. Remember at the very beginning we're describing the monosaccharides, the monosaccharide sugars. You've got glucose, fructose, and galactose. So one of those is fructose. Fructose is an interesting one in regards to the absorption within the small intestines. We won't go into too much detail of that now, but an overconsumption of fructose can go and affect your liver, right? And it can actually, you can actually develop something called non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and that is the direct result of an overconsumption of fructose, which is a type of sugar. As we discussed previously, increased amounts of sugar can increase dental cavities. can increase weight gain. It can increase blood pressure and heart disease. Have I sold you on reducing your sugar intake? Well, I hope I have. Now this is where it gets interesting. Resistant starch. Now, resistant starch is still technically a carbohydrate, right? However, it actually resists digestion within the small intestines and will actually go into the large intestines where it will act like a dietary fibre, and it will become fermented and it will actually improve digestive health. So there are a number of different food items which are high in resistant starch. You have lentils, you got different beans and peas, potato starch here. Also green banana. You can actually get this in Woolworths. It's called green banana powder, and it's a processed form of green banana, and it's very high in resistant starch. The other one is potatoes, either sweet potatoes or normal potatoes. Now, not just potatoes, you've actually got to transform it into a resistant starch. So when you cook a potato and cool a potato, after you cool the potato, the carbohydrates will actually kind of become, let's say, wonky, become a resistant starch. Thereby, if you eat cold potatoes after it's been cooked, it will be a resistant starch and will actually be beneficial to health. So what actually happens is when you, let's take this example here. So we've got food right here. We eat food and it goes into our small intestines. Starch, which is a type of carbohydrate, will be absorbed within the small intestines and be utilized for energy. Okay, whereas resistant starch will go into the large intestines here, where it actually produces a number of things. It can actually reduce your pH in your large intestines, which is a good thing, and it can also produce something called short chain fatty acids. Now, these short chain fatty acids have been shown to reduce the risk of a number of colon cancers, can actually improve the integrity of the intestines, and overall we want short chain fatty acids within our large intestines. These resistant starch, they're food, in very simple terms, they're food for the bacteria within your gut. And also probiotics, probiotics meaning live beneficial bacteria. So what are some other benefits of resistant starch? First of all, it supports with energy intake, weight management, and obesity. Why? Because it still contains food. It still fills up your stomach, but it's very low energy. So the density of energy is low. Thereby, it will actually reduce your overall kilojoule intake, which may thereby improve weight management and obesity. And so it can actually support with glycemic control. So remember how we spoke about earlier your glycemic index and your glycemic response. So we can actually control this peak of sugar within your blood by simply adding resistant starch, because it will actually slow down the release of glucose within your small intestines. It can be beneficial for blood lipids and heart health, as it has properties to actually reduce cholesterol and also triglycerides. As I mentioned earlier, supports bowel health. I really think this is one of the major things you should take away from resistant starch, is that it supports bowel health, the production of short chain fatty acids. Okay, moving on to a different element of carbohydrates is your dietary fibre. Now, dietary fibre can be found in a variety of plant-based sources. You've got your oats down here, which is a great source of dietary fibre, and a variety of different vegetables, prunes, nuts, and so forth. It's very similar to, let's say, resistant starch. It will actually resist digestion, okay, meaning that your body won't utilize it for its glucose content, and will actually be fermented within the large intestines. Now, dietary fiber isn't just a single category of, okay, this food is a dietary fiber. It is an overall, let's say, group of particular foods, such as cellulose here, pectins and gums and so forth. Now, adequate dietary fiber is essential for proper functioning of your gut, especially your small and large intestines, and it can actually reduce the risk of a variety of different diseases, which we will go into now. Okay, some of the health benefits of dietary fiber. Look at this, same as above, supports with energy intake, weight management, and obesity. Why? Because it is generally regarded as low kilojoule producing per gram, that is. Also supports with lipids, so it reduces cholesterol, reduces triglycerides, good for bowel health as well. The different element here for bowel health is it actually supports with something called diverticulitis, right here. So please excuse my terrible drawing, but we're going to draw intestines right here, okay? So this is your large intestine right here, okay? And then in here is of course is your small intestines. Now, diverticulitis, if we can actually take a zoom in on the wall of the large intestines, let's go up here and let's make this large. Diverticulitis is basically there's like a pouch within the wall of the large intestine, which isn't meant to be there. When we consume dietary fiber, it supports with regular bowel motions, it supports with the prevention of constipation, and if someone has long-term constipation, you can imagine everything in let's say here in your large intestines will get backed up and it will need to go somewhere, and then one of the mechanisms of action is to actually produce these little pouches here, which is this element right here. So having adequate dietary fiber within your diet can reduce the risk of diverticulitis and support overall bowel health. Especially, and here's another one, cancers, especially colon cancer, because of this element of supporting the pH within the large intestines, and also the production of short-chain fatty acids. Lipids. Okay, fats. Possibly the most misunderstood macronutrient there is. 50 years ago, I would have said all fats are bad. However, as more and more research has come out in recent years, I can now say some fats are bad, whereas other fats are actually extremely good for human health. So let's explore. So fats, aka lipids, they are the most concentrated form of energy in the body, producing 37 kilojoules per gram. Fats should supply between 20 and 35% of our energy intake, and will actually aid in the absorption of fat-soluble vitamins. I do actually recommend you remember these fat-soluble vitamins, as that's something you may be assessed on. We'll discuss these fat-soluble vitamins in more depth next week when we look at micronutrients, that is your vitamins, your minerals, and how they can support optimal health. Another thing I'll add in regards to the absorption of fat-soluble nutrients is we need about 5 grams of fat to stimulate our gallbladder. Now, our gallbladder is this pouch which is attached in our above our liver, below our liver, behind our liver, which releases bile. Now, bile is essential for actually supporting the absorption of fat. So when we take, let's say, a supplement with these fat-soluble nutrients, or we consume foods which are high in these fat-soluble nutrients, it's important that we consume fat alongside it. Okay, lipids. So there are, just like other macronutrients, fats have a number of different categories. There are 3 groups of lipids. You've got your triglycerides, phospholipids, and sterols. Your triglycerides account for about 95% of fats. Okay, so if we can actually break these triglycerides down into further groups, you've got saturated fats, monounsaturated fatty acids, and polyunsaturated fatty acids. Saturated fats contain no double bond. They are fully saturated with hydrogen, whereas your monounsaturated fatty acids have got 1 double bond, mono meaning 1. Your polyunsaturated fatty acids contain 2 or more double bonds. Okay. Another thing to note is as you go down in this line, okay, and you develop more and more double bonds within the triglyceride, they become more and more sensitive to light and heat. So saturated fats, you can deep fry them all you like, fantastic, they won't go rancid. However, as you go down, let's say polyunsaturated fatty acids, such as your omega-3 and omega-6, if you expose them to light or heat, it will make them go rancid. Let's say it will make them go off. So that's one element to take into account. There is one other group of fats we will discuss, and that is trans fats. These trans fats are man-made, and they only occur in processed foods and are extremely detrimental to health. Okay, let's break down these fatty acids. So fatty acids can be broken down into saturated fatty acids. The smaller breakdowns of saturated fatty acids you don't necessarily need to know. Just bear in mind these larger groups would be a preference. The other major group is unsaturated fats. Within unsaturated fats, you've got your monounsaturated fatty acids and your polyunsaturated fatty acids. Within your polyunsaturated fatty acids, you've got your omega-3 and your omega-6. Now, a lot of you would be familiar with omega-3. Omega-3 is fish oil. It's found high amounts in fatty fish. And you'll see it, in chemists and other health food shops, the promotion of fish oil. You can break the omega-3 down even further to EPA and DHA, or a plant-based omega-3. And you've also, let's go, in your omega-6, some are good, some are bad. There's another slide on that, we'll discuss that there. Okay, now in nature, you don't just have one food that is completely saturated, or you don't have one food that is completely polyunsaturated omega-3. They generally have a mix of all. Of note, saturated fats, which are these ones right here, are vastly or mainly derived from animal-based foods, okay? Except for coconut. Look at this. Coconut is extremely high in saturated fats. Extremely high. It is actually one of the highest saturated fat containing foods per gram there is in the environment. You've got down here, you've got your mono unsaturated fats, so that's things like your olive oil, right? With the blue right here. This is blue, this is your mono unsaturated fat. Vast majority of that is mono. Then you come down here to your polyunsaturated fatty acids right here. Look at that. You can see your omega-3, which is the primary health benefit one, is in yellow. The highest food source here is flax seeds. Now, I will also add to this list, you've got hemp seeds are very high in omega-3. Chia seeds are very high in omega-3. And then also what's not on this list is fish. Fatty seafood fish are very high in omega-3. All right, let's discuss saturated fats. Saturated fats, as we alluded to in the previous slide, are found in mainly animal-based products, so milks, butters, cheeses, meats, but then also found in coconut oil. Now, if there's one thing you're going to write down and remember regarding saturated fats, it's this one right here. It is not recommended to consume more than 10% of your daily kilojoule intake from saturated fats. Now, when we do our dietary analysis in your tutorial on Monday, you'll actually be able to produce how much of your diet is coming from saturated fats. If it's more than 10%, then that is something we need to address. So we'll discuss it in the tutorial this week on whether or not you have above 10% of your kilojoule intake from saturated fats. Also, as I mentioned earlier, saturated fats are very stable to high temperatures and the exposure of light. So they can be, generally they're sold in, let's say, a clear bottle because they can be exposed to light, no issue at all. Right, so there's other categories of saturated fats. You've got your long chain fatty acids, your medium chain fatty acids, and your short chain fatty acids. Now, your long chain fatty acids have got the greatest amount of research saying that they're actually detrimental to health. Higher intakes of long chain fatty acids can actually increase the risk of cardiovascular disease. The other two categories, medium chain and short chain, can actually be quite beneficial to health. Coronavirus, excuse me. Short chain fatty acids, you should remember this. Remember, when we eat resistant starch or dietary fibers, your body can actually make short chain fatty acids, right? You can actually consume short chain fatty acids as well, and that supports with bowel health. You can also get something called medium chain fatty acids. Now, I'll show you this one. This just came in from my cupboard. Some healthy individuals will actually get, it's called MCT oil, or medium chain fatty acids, and it's directly derived from coconut oil. And because of its structure, because of its size being medium chain, it can actually, let's say, bypass digestion and get utilized more effectively, and has actually been shown to actually support with weight loss and increase in insulin sensitivity. So remember what we said earlier about a high amount of simple carbohydrates can cause insulin resistance. Potentially medium chain fatty acids can support with this insulin sensitivity. All right, trans fats. Where are trans fats found, you ask? Well, they are found in everything that is delicious. Right, so generally it's processed foods. Your fried chicken, your fried chips, your burgers, your cakes, your Tim Tams, your soft serve ice creams, some breads, some cereals, some cakes, and so forth. So everything delicious. Now, trans fats are added to food. They're man-made. They're added to food to improve taste and actually extend the shelf life of these food items. Now, a report has come out saying that about 0.5% of Australian New Zealanders consume, Australian New Zealanders consume 0.5% of their daily kilojoule intake from trans fats. Now, this is a problem because there is no safe upper limit for trans fats, meaning that we shouldn't be consuming any trans fats at all. An intake or a high intake or any intake of trans fats can increase your low density lipoproteins, so that is your bad cholesterol, and it can also increase total cholesterol, thereby increasing the risk of cardiovascular disease. So not a good thing at all. It'll be interesting to see how much trans fats are in your own diet when we come around to analysing the diet. So make sure you pay attention to that. Monounsaturated fatty acids. Mono, one double covalent bond. Found in things like olive oil, canola oil, peanut oil as well. The beauty of monounsaturated fats is they can withstand some heat without becoming rancid. Thereby, they're good for cooking. Now, monounsaturated fats are actually synthesized in the body and thus are not actually required in the diet. Polyunsaturated fatty acids, one of my favorite fats. There are two groups. We alluded to this earlier. You have omega-3 and omega-6. A lot of what we're going to be saying will focus on omega-3 because that is the beneficial one, the one that is known to reduce the risk of disease. Now, omega-3 protects against cardiovascular disease and is known to actually reduce anti-inflammatory, reduce inflammation, that is. Thereby, you could actually say that the consumption of omega-3 within the diet from fatty, oily fish can actually support with the treatment of inflammatory diseases such as autoimmune disease, cardiovascular disease, and cancers and so forth. Omega-3, especially DHA, which is a subgroup of omega-3, supports with brain development and function, supports with mental health, cognitive impairment such as dementia and so forth. What is worth interesting is here, depression. In recent years, depression is moving away from the thinking that it's a lack of neurotransmitters, serotonin and dopamine, and more so an inflammatory condition. So thereby, if you consume something that is anti-inflammatory, it may thereby support with depression. Now remember last week when we looked at nutritional assessment, okay? What was the deficiency signs of lack of omega-3? They were rough, scaly, dry skin. So that's an indication you can look out for. Now, in the last 150 years, the intake of omega-6 has actually increased, where the intake of omega-3 has actually decreased. Now, some observational data has actually seen that this trend is in line with the increase in heart disease. Right, so omega-6 and omega-3, there's a bit of biochemistry here, nutritional biochemistry. They get converted and so forth. Let's start off at omega-6. So omega-6 foods are things like your corn oil, plant-derived, which can also then, let's move back here, move into arachidonic acid. Now, arachidonic acid is found in eggs and meats, and arachidonic acid is what we call pro-inflammatory, meaning that it increases inflammation. Whereas on the other side, we've got omega-3. We've got plant-based omega-3 here, your ALA, and then we've got your EPA, yeah, and DHA. EPA and DHA are found in fatty fish and also in fish oil supplements. Now, something to note is, okay, this is a conversion, so we actually convert plant-based omega-3 all the way down into active EPA and DHA. Of the consumption of your plant-based omega-3 up here, right? So things like your flax seeds, your chia seeds, your hemp seeds, only 4% of plant-based omega-3s will actually be converted into EPA and DHA. So we could potentially say that individuals who follow a vegan diet may be at risk of low levels of EPA and DHA on a cellular level. That is an issue because they support with the inflammatory response, reducing inflammation. So these two image A, image B, this is your cell membrane, right? If we consume a diet high in arachidonic acid, that is from eggs and meats, it can actually produce too much arachidonic acid. Now, on a cellular level, this arachidonic acid embeds itself within the cell membrane of each and every cell, okay? And when we have an inflammatory response, let's say a trigger coming along, more inflammation will be released because arachidonic acid goes on to produce inflammation on a very crude level. Whereas if you have more EPA and DHA, indicated here by the blue and the green, you have less inflammation on a cellular level. A number of research articles have come out. Every week there's a new research article supporting the benefits of omega-3. This particular research article describes the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3. Now, generally speaking, in the Western countries, our diets are about that 15:1 ratio, 15 part omega-6 to 1 part omega-3. Whereas to actually support with inflammation, you want to really be between that 2:1. So 2 part omega-6 to 1 part omega-3. However, the vast majority of people here in Western countries consume too much omega-6. Protein. Let's move on to protein. Now, protein can be found in a variety of different foods. And before you judge me, yes, there is protein in broccoli. So all vegans, hooray. Generally speaking, humans require about 1 gram of protein per kilo of body weight. So if you weigh 60 kilos, each day you generally require 60 grams of protein. That is a very crude analogy. A more accurate information on the amount of protein each individual requires can be found in your reading this week. So I do suggest that you look over that and look over how different amounts of proteins are required at different stages in life. So yes, your protein-rich foods are your meats, your cheeses, your eggs. You've also got your vegetarian sources over here. You've got your nuts, you've got your buckwheat, your quinoa, your tofu, your lentils, your peas, your beans, and your broccoli. Now, what's quite interesting is after the ingestion of protein, our stomach acid, being really acidic, will actually denature these proteins and we'll split them up into what we call peptides or even individual amino acids. Now, if someone has low stomach acid, that is a high pH, then they won't be able to denature these proteins, thereby getting access to these individual amino acids. Amino acids. Right, so in this image here we can see that individual amino acids go on to form peptides, which then go on to form protein. Now, there are 20 amino acids found within protein, and some of them are classed as essential, and some of them are classed as non-essential, or conditionally essential. We'll get into what that means in 2 slides' time. But what I do want to illustrate here is the vast amount of protein within our body. So I'll give you an example. If there was a 76 kilo man, he would contain 12 kilos of protein within his body. And that's 17% of your body weight. The vast majority of it, yes, is in your muscles, skin, blood, and so forth. Now, another source of protein is actually within your small intestines. So within your small intestines, your cells turn over every 4 to 5 days. Now, when these cells will actually slough off, yes, that is a term, slough off, they will then be denatured and broken down, and your body can actually recycle these proteins and actually add them to your protein pool. Your protein pool, it isn't, let's say, an organ within your body where you store your protein. It's just your overall amount of protein within your body. Okay, protein occurs in all living cells and has functional and structural properties. So let's look at a few of them. Enzymes, right here. Let's start with enzymes. Your digestive enzymes. The backbone is actually protein. Your cell membrane, a number of, let's say, receptors on your cells, and actually the structural component of your cells are protein derived. Within your blood, hemoglobin, albumin are actually all elements of protein, requiring protein. You've got over here your particular collagen as well within your joints requires protein. Up here, look at this. Your immune system requires protein. The production of antibodies to fight off infection requires protein. You would have seen with this COVID-19 or coronavirus that some individuals can actually still be spreading the disease after they have contracted the coronavirus. Potentially, one hypothesis could say is that they're not fully amounting an immune response. They're not producing these antibodies to be able to remember the structure of the coronavirus and then thereby be able to defend it off. That's just one element at play. There's other elements involved in the production of antibodies such as vitamin C, vitamin D, and so forth. I might touch on that next week. Okay. Types of protein, right? We've got 2 major groups. You've got your essential amino acids and your non-essential amino acids. Your essential amino acids are required to be consumed in your diet because your body is unable to make them. Whereas your non-essential amino acids, your body can actually convert other amino acids or other proteins into these amino acids. Now, animal proteins are regarded as better than plant proteins because they are what we call a complete set of amino acids. They contain all essential amino acids. Many vegetarian sources of protein are incomplete, meaning that they do not contain all the essential amino acids. However, you can actually combine high protein source or high protein rich foods to make a complete protein. They've done this throughout history for years. So let's look at Japan and China. The combination of rice and tofu will actually make a complete protein. In South Asia, especially in India, the combination of rice and lentils. Rice lacks a few essential amino acids, so does lentils. However, when you join them together, they create a complete protein. And then if you look at, let's say, areas in Mexico, rice and black-eyed peas will make a complete protein source. Amino acids. Okay, so here we have your list of essential amino acids, your conditionally essential amino acids, and your non-essential amino acids. No, you do not need to remember all of these amino acids. That would be too mean of me. However, you do need to know that there's essential amino acids and non-essential amino acids and what that means. Now, what happens when we don't have enough protein or we consume too much protein? If we've got lower amounts of protein, that can affect our, our immune system, muscle loss, fatigue. Okay? When we have high amounts of protein, it's actually been associated with high levels of cholesterol. Okay? Whether that be I would say that that's association and not causation. I don't think, or the research doesn't indicate that high protein causes cholesterol. However, individuals who eat high protein foods may actually eat other foods that may increase their cholesterol. So it's more of an association, an observation rather than causation. High intake of protein can actually increase your risk of heart disease and cancers, right? Especially colon cancers. May contribute to bone loss. It can affect or increase the risk of kidney disease because your kidneys have got to filter out the excessive amounts of amino acids, and can potentially contribute to the development of obesity, diabetes, and cancer. So having the correct balance of all of these macronutrients, especially your fats, carbohydrates, and proteins, are essential for optimal health. Okay, this concludes the lecture for session 3. I will see you all on Monday for your tutorial. Happy eating! Okay, we're done.
Yeah, your mom called you a few times. Oh, mom.
Sorry. How long was that?
A long, long time.
It wasn't a long, long time, was it?
Oh, long.